The January wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing through the backyard of a small house on the edge of a rural town. In the corner where snow had piled into drifts stood a metal cage, its bars glistening with frost like bones in the moonlight. Inside, curled into a tight ball, trembled a dog, an Alabai, whose once powerful frame now seemed a shadow. Her fur, matted and dirty, couldn't shield her gaunt body from the cold, and her breath escaped in short, fleeting clouds, dissolving into the icy air. Bella, so they called her, kept her head down. Her eyes, dark as the winter night, stared into nothingness, holding no fight, only exhaustion. The backyard was silent, save for the occasional creak of the gate swinging in the wind. The house, with its sagging porch and dim light glowing from a window, stood quiet. The owner, a man with a heavy gaze and hands reeking of tobacco, stayed inside. He had set up the cage 3 days ago, tossing Bella onto the bare metal without food, water, or bedding. "Deserved it," was all he said when a neighbor, old Margaret Johnson, dared to ask. Her voice quivered, but he only spat into the snow and slammed the door. Margaret, a woman with a stooped back and hands roughened by life, couldn't shake the image of Bella's gaze. She knew dogs. She'd spent her life caring for strays, feeding the homeless ones, stitching their wounds. But Bella was different. Her silence, her stillness, wasn't just weakness. It was a pain too deep for howls. Margaret hadn't slept for 2 nights, listening to the wind, dreading she'd find the dog dead by morning. She knew the owner wouldn't relent. His cruelty wasn't a burst of anger, but a cold, unyielding conviction, as bitter as the frost. In the morning, wrapped in an old scarf, Margaret called her niece, Sarah, a woman with a fierce spirit who helped a local animal rescue. Sarah wasn't a typical volunteer. She didn't post online or fundraise. She was the one who acted, finding vets, transporting animals, securing permits. Margaret, stumbling over her words, told her about the cage, about Bella, about the owner's words. "Sarah, she won't survive." Her voice broke. "We have to do something." Sarah listened, her fingers tightening around the phone. She knew men like this owner, people who saw a dog as nothing more than a tool, punishing even imagined betrayal without mercy. "I'm coming," she said. "Wait for me." Margaret nodded, though Sarah couldn't see her. She stepped into the backyard, her eyes falling on the cage where Bella still lay, her breath so faint it seemed the snow might bury her forever. Margaret clenched her fists. She couldn't change the world, but she could try to save this dog. And that was enough to start. Snow crunched under Sarah's boots as she stepped out of her car, parked by the sagging fence. The cold stung her cheeks, but her gaze was as hard as the ice beneath her feet. She carried a warm blanket and a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark to reveal the backyard's outlines. The cage stood in the corner, half buried in a snowdrift, and in it, Bella, her body seemingly part of the icy prison. Sarah paused, her breath catching. The dog didn't move, but her eyes, catching the light, flickered like embers in ash. There was life in them, faint but stubborn. Margaret waited by the gate, her scarf slipping to reveal gray strands of hair. "Sarah, she's in bad shape," she whispered, her voice trembling not just from the cold. Sarah nodded, her face stern, but her eyes flashing with pain. She'd seen many dogs, beaten, starved, abandoned, but Bella was different. Her silence, her stillness, spoke not of fear but of surrender, as if she'd accepted her fate. That was worse than a howl. That was despair. Sarah approached the cage, her steps careful not to startle the dog. She knelt, ignoring the snow soaking her jeans. "Bella," she called softly, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm here." The dog didn't respond, though her ears twitched, as if her name still meant something. Sarah noticed Bella's paws pressed against her body, crusted with ice. Her hind leg lay at an odd angle, as if she feared moving it. Sarah clenched her jaw. Time was slipping away. The house's door creaked, and the owner stepped onto the porch. His heavy, angular figure seemed part of the frozen yard. A cigarette glowed in his hand, its ember the only warm spot in the scene. "What are you meddling for?" he growled, his voice rough as gravel. "She's my business." "Deserved it." Margaret stepped back, her fingers clutching her scarf, but Sarah didn't budge. She met his eyes, her gaze colder than the frost. "For what?" she asked, her voice sharp as a blade. "For trusting you?" The man spat, his face twisting. "She ate a chick, betrayed me. I fed her and she... ungrateful mutt." Sarah didn't reply. She knew arguing was pointless. His words weren't an explanation, but an excuse. She turned to Bella, her hand resting on the blanket she'd brought. "We're taking her," she said, not looking at him. It wasn't a request, it was a decision. Margaret, standing behind, felt her heart tighten. She remembered Bella, once strong, bounding across the yard, her bark echoing through the town. Back then she was proud, loyal, her eyes always seeking her owner's approval. Now those eyes were empty, and Margaret knew it wasn't a chick or a fox that broke her. It was human cruelty. She looked at Sarah, whose hands were already prying open the rusty cage door, and felt a spark of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Sarah eased the cage door open, its rusted hinges screeching through the quiet yard. The freezing air seemed to thicken, but she didn't feel the cold. Her eyes were fixed on Bella, whose body, bound by ice and pain, barely stirred. The dog didn't resist or help. Her frozen, motionless paws seemed foreign to her. Sarah reached out, her calloused fingers brushing Bella's fur, cold and stiff as wire. "Come on, girl," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a desperate need to hold on to this fading life. Margaret stood nearby, her breath clouding in the frosty air. She clutched the blanket Sarah had tossed her tear-filled eyes tracking her niece's every move. She wanted to help, but feared her clumsiness would do more harm. Bella was large, even emaciated, and extracting her from the cage was no easy task. Sarah carefully slid her hands under the dog's body, avoiding the injured hind leg. Bella let out a faint sound, not a growl, not a whimper, but something in between, as if pain and hope had tangled in her throat. The owner watched from the porch, his cigarette burned to ash, but he didn't move. His face, lit by the dim window light, was a mask. "She'll die, and good riddance," he muttered, as Sarah finally freed Bella and wrapped her in the blanket. Margaret flinched, her lips tightening, but Sarah didn't respond. She knew words wouldn't change him. Her mission was to save Bella, not waste energy on someone who'd already condemned her. Sarah carried the dog to the car, her steps slow to avoid jostling Bella. Margaret shuffled behind, her hands trembling but holding the flashlight to light the way. The car, an old van warmed up in advance, waited by the fence. Sarah laid Bella on the back seat where another blanket waited and checked her breathing. It was weak but steady. "Hold on," she said, her voice almost a command. Bella's eyes closed, but her chest still rose. Margaret climbed into the front seat, her fingers twisting the edge of her scarf. "Where to now, Sarah?" she asked, her voice thick with worry. Sarah started the engine, her face taut. "To Emma's," she replied. Emma was their friend, a woman who'd once been a nurse and now treated animals in her home. Not a licensed vet, but someone whose hands knew how to bring life back. Sarah trusted her like no one else. The car pulled away, leaving behind the yard, the cage, and the owner's figure fading into the blizzard. Margaret glanced in the side mirror, her heart aching with the injustice. She remembered how Bella once licked her hand through the fence, her eyes full of trust. That trust had been crushed. But Margaret felt there was still a chance. Sarah, gripping the wheel, thought the same. Bella was alive, and that was a start. Fragile, but real. Emma's house stood at the edge of town, its windows glowing with soft yellow light through the storm. The old wooden fence, dusted with snow, creaked in the wind, but inside it was warm, smelling of herbs and something homely, as if time had paused. Sarah carried Bella, still wrapped in the blanket, her arms trembling from the effort, but steady. Margaret followed, her face pale, her fingers still clutching her scarf like a talisman. Bella didn't move, her breathing so faint that Sarah kept checking to make sure she was still there. Emma, a short woman with cropped gray hair and hands scarred from life, was waiting. Her sharp eyes softened when she saw Bella. "Put her here," she said, pointing to a table covered with clean sheets. Her voice was calm, but it carried a strength that brooked no fuss. Sarah gently laid Bella down, her fingers lingering on the dog's fur, as if afraid to let go. Emma bent over Bella, her hands moving swiftly but gently. She checked the pulse, examined the paws, frowning at the frostbitten pads and the limp hind leg. "Rough shape," she murmured, but her tone wasn't hopeless. "Starvation, cold, injury. But she's a fighter." Margaret, standing by the door, felt her throat tighten. She wanted to ask if Bella would live, but the words stuck. Instead, she watched as Emma pulled out an IV drip, vials of medicine, and heating pads, her movements precise as a surgeon's. Sarah assisted, handing over tools, her face focused. She'd seen Emma work before, and knew if anyone could save Bella, it was her. Emma administered fluids to warm the dog and stabilize her, then began gently treating the frostbitten paws. Bella didn't react, her eyes half closed, but her chest rose, and that was enough to keep Margaret from crying. "She's strong," Sarah said quietly, and Emma nodded, not looking up from her work. The room filled with silence, broken only by the rustle of movement and the wind's whistle outside. Margaret remembered her own dog, a mutt named Rusty, dying in her arms years ago. She'd been helpless then, and that powerlessness still burned her heart. Now, watching Bella, she felt that same pain, but Emma and Sarah, women who didn't give up, were here. That gave her hope, thin as a thread but strong. When Emma finished, she straightened, her face tired but her eyes alight. "Now we wait," she said. If she makes it through the night, she's got a shot. Sarah nodded, her fingers gripping the table's edge. Margaret stepped closer, her gaze on Bella, whose fur, still dirty, seemed a little less cold. She wanted to touch the dog but hesitated, afraid to disturb her fragile peace. Instead, she whispered, "Hang in there, girl." And in that moment, she believed Bella heard her. The silence in Emma's house was thick as the snow outside, broken only by the crackle of logs in the fireplace and Bella's occasional sighs. The dog lay on the table, swaddled in blankets, her body trembling now from warmth, not cold. The IV, delicate as a spider's web, fed into her paw, slowly restoring strength. Sarah sat nearby, her reddened eyes fixed on Bella. Margaret settled on an old couch in the corner, her hands twisting her scarf, her thoughts circling the dog, whose life hung by a thread. Emma moved between the table and a cabinet where she kept her supplies, her steps light but her face tense. She checked Bella's pulse, her warm, steady fingers searching for signs of improvement. "Her temperature is rising," she said softly, almost to herself. "That's good." But her voice didn't hide her worry. Frostbite, starvation, the injured leg. It was a heavy burden for a dog whose will to live seemed to be fading. Emma knew the night would decide everything. Sarah leaned closer to Bella, her hand resting on the blanket without touching her. "You'll make it," she whispered, her voice soft but steely. She remembered another dog, a stray she'd found on a roadside years ago. That one didn't survive, and the pain still lingered in her heart. Bella was different. Her eyes, even half closed, held a spark Sarah couldn't ignore. She wouldn't let that spark die. Margaret in the corner felt helpless, her life full of losses, her husband gone too soon, her children scattered across the country, had taught her to cherish moments when she could make a difference. Bella was that moment. She looked at Emma, at Sarah, at the dog, and her heart ached with the unfairness. Why should Bella, loyal and strong, suffer for human blindness? But in this room, filled with warmth and care, she saw hope, quiet, like Bella's breath, but real. Emma returned to the table, replacing a cooled heating pad. "If she starts responding," she said, glancing at Sarah, "we can pull her through." Sarah nodded, her fingers tightening on the blanket. She didn't ask what would happen if Bella didn't respond. The question hung in the air, but no one dared voice it. Instead, they waited, their eyes locked on the dog, whose chest rose a little more noticeably than an hour before. The night dragged on, each minute an eternity. Margaret dozed off, her head slumped on her shoulder, but Sarah and Emma stayed awake. As dawn began to lighten the windows, Bella stirred, her ears twitched and her eyes cracked open, catching the lamp's faint glow. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding. Emma stepped closer, a faint smile breaking on her face. "There's my girl," she whispered. Bella was still weak, but she was fighting. And that was enough to make the night a beginning, not an end. Days at Emma's house passed slowly, like melting snow dripping from the roof. Bella lay on a soft bed Emma had made in the corner, her body still frail but no longer so brittle. The IVs gave way to injections. Her frostbitten paws began to heal, though her hind leg remained stiff, a reminder of the cage. Sarah visited daily, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. She sat by Bella, saying nothing, just being there, letting the dog get used to her presence. Margaret came too, bringing homemade broth that Emma carefully spooned into Bella's mouth. Bella didn't eat on her own, her eyes, though open, staring past them. But the emptiness that had scared Sarah on the first day was fading. Sometimes Bella's ears twitched, catching Emma's voice or the creak of the door, a sign she was coming back. Emma, checking her paws, noticed Bella tense slightly at her touch, but didn't growl or pull away. "She's learning to trust," Emma said one day, wiping her hands on her apron, "but her heart's still in that cage." Sarah nodded, her eyes on Bella. She remembered her own life feeling like a cage once, a marriage full of silent resentments, a job that drained her. She'd escaped, but the scars remained. Bella was like her, strong but broken, and Sarah knew trust didn't come quickly. She brought Bella bits of meat, leaving them nearby without forcing her to eat. One morning, Bella reached for a piece, her nose twitching as she licked it. Sarah froze, her heart swelling with joy. It wasn't just hunger, it was a step toward life. Margaret, seeing this, beamed. "Look, Sarah, she wants to live." Her voice was warm, as if she were talking about her own child. She remembered her granddaughter, as a toddler, learning to walk while clinging to her hands. Bella was the same, each movement, each glance a victory. Margaret sat by the bed, her fingers twisting her scarf, telling Bella about her garden, the flowers that would bloom in spring. She didn't know if the dog understood, but she felt her voice mattered. Emma watched them, her usually stern face softening. "She needs time," she said, looking at Bella. And people who won't betray her. Sarah and Margaret exchanged a glance, their silence full of agreement. They knew Bella wasn't just a dog. She was a mirror of their own losses, their struggles, their hope. Each day with her was a promise that her story wouldn't end in that icy cage. In the evening, as the sun painted the snow outside golden, Bella lifted her head for the first time, her gaze settling on Sarah. It wasn't trust, but there was a spark in her eyes. Not fear, not pain, but something alive. Sarah smiled, her hand hovering over the bed. "Good girl," she whispered. And in that moment, she believed Bella, like them, would find her way to the light, even if the path was long. Spring crept into the town, melting snow and exposing damp earth. At Emma's house, the scent of herbs gave way to blooming lilacs by the fence. Bella, now moving with a slight limp, no longer spent her days on the bed. Her paws, still weak, carried her across the room, and her fur, cleaned by Sarah, gleamed like dark amber. She remained cautious, her deep, watchful eyes tracking every movement, but the icy emptiness of those first days was gone. Sarah's daily visits became as natural to Bella as the warmth of the fireplace. Sarah didn't rush her, didn't demand affection, but brought small gifts, a piece of cheese, a rope toy she'd braided. Bella ignored them at first, but one day, when Sarah set down an apple, Bella slowly reached for it, her nose brushing the smooth skin. She didn't eat it, but that curious gesture was a triumph for Sarah. Her heart tightened, like a warm memory, and she smiled, her eyes locked on Bella. Margaret, whose visits grew less frequent due to aching knees, still brought broth and her stories. She sat on a chair, her soft, unhurried voice telling Bella about the past, dogs that lived in her yard, her granddaughter who promised to visit in summer. Bella listened, her ears twitching slightly, and Margaret felt her words built a bridge between them. Seeing Bella change filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Emma noticed Bella responding to her voice. When she called, Bella lifted her head, her eyes seeking Emma, a hint of trust flickering in them. Not fear, not submission, but something new. "She's learning," Emma said one day, wiping her hands on a towel. "But she needs someone who won't let her down." Sarah nodded, her thoughts on Bella's future. She knew Emma's house was only a temporary haven, and Bella needed her own place, her own people. One evening as the sun set, painting the sky pink, Sarah took Bella into the yard. The dog walked slowly, her limp noticeable but her movements steady. Sarah sat on the grass, her hand resting on the ground, not touching Bella. The dog paused, her gaze sliding over Sarah's face, then took a step closer and lay down beside her, her warm body brushing Sarah's hand. It wasn't affection, but it was a choice. Sarah held her breath, her eyes shining. "You trust me," she whispered, her voice catching. Margaret, watching from the window, felt tears sting her eyes. She remembered her husband, long gone, bringing home a puppy and saying, "He'll teach us to love." Bella was that lesson, not just for her, but for Sarah, for Emma. They were all learning again, to trust, to hope, to believe. In that fragile moment, with the dog and woman simply together, Margaret saw a light, faint but unyielding. Summer arrived quietly, with the scent of grass and warm breezes stirring dust on the dirt roads. Bella, her limp now barely noticeable, stood in Emma's yard, her fur catching the sunlight like dark gold. She no longer hid in corners, her calm, deep gaze following a butterfly flitting over the flowers. Sarah, sitting on the porch, watched her, her heart full, not of joy, but of something deeper, as if she'd found a piece of peace long lost. Margaret, visiting that day, held a basket of apples, her smile soft as the summer light. They found Bella a home. It took time. Emma and Sarah searched for someone who would understand her, not expecting guard duty or heroics. They found James, a former dog trainer living in a nearby town. His yard was simple, with a wooden fence and an old apple tree, but it radiated warmth. James didn't want a working dog. He wanted a companion. When he first saw Bella, his weary eyes softened. "She's mine," he said simply. And Emma, usually stern, nodded, trusting his words. The move was quiet. Sarah drove Bella, her hand resting nearby, ready to support but not touching. Bella looked out the window, her ears twitching at the sound of the wind. When they arrived, James waited at the gate, his large, work-worn hands empty. No leash, no treats, just himself. Bella stepped out, her movements slow but sure. She stopped before James, her gaze meeting his, and something clicked, like a key finding its lock. Margaret, standing a little ways off, felt tears burn her eyes. She remembered Bella in the cage, her breath barely visible, the world seeming frozen. Now this dog, who'd survived betrayal and pain, stood under an apple tree, her fur gleaming, her tail giving a slight wag for the first time in months. Margaret knew Bella would never forget the cage, but she'd learned to live beyond it, a miracle woven from their shared faith. James asked nothing of Bella, but to be herself. She slept in the house, on a soft bed by the fireplace, ate from a bowl he filled with care, and sometimes, in quiet evenings, rested her head on his knee. Her bark, once sharp and anxious, softened, as if she now guarded not a yard but the warmth she'd found. Sarah, visiting, saw Bella greet her not with caution, but with faint curiosity, and that was her victory. That day, driving away from James's house, Sarah and Margaret were silent, their hearts full. They knew Bella was home, not just within walls, but in a world where she was loved for being, not serving. Margaret looked at the road, dust settling in the sunlight, and whispered, "You made us better, girl." Sarah smiled, her hand tightening on the wheel. Bella had taught them all, to love without fear, trust without conditions, hope even when the world felt like ice. And in that was her strength, fragile but unbreakable.